The Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions will please come to order. This morning we're holding our first hearing this Congress on the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, which will focus on the final report of the Task Force on Government Regulation of Higher Education. Senator Murray and I will each have an opening statement, then we'll introduce our panel of witnesses. Senator Mikulski will introduce one of the witnesses, and at that time make whatever comment she would like to make, because she has to leave about 10:30 for another hearing. After our witness testimony, senators will have 5 minutes of questions. Sometimes it's best to approach a subject with examples, so let me use 3. More than a year ago, Vanderbilt University hired the Boston Consulting Group to determine how much it cost the university to comply with federal rules and regulations on higher education. The answer, $150 million. Or 11% of the university's total non-hospital expenditures last year. Let me repeat that. In 1 year, $150 million, or 11% of the university's total non-hospital expenditures. Vanderbilt Chancellor Nick Zeppos, who will testify today, says that this adds about $11,000 in additional tuition per year for each of the university's 12,757 students. I met a parent this morning, Chancellor Zeppos, who said he'd sent in his $11,000 already. The second example, each year 20 million American families fill out a complicated 108-question form called the FAFSA, Free Application for Federal Student Aid to obtain a grant or loan to help pay for college. This is the FAFSA. 20 million students. Several experts testified before this committee last year, at hearing Senator Harkin presided over, that answering just 2 questions would tell the Department of Education 95% of what it needs to know to determine a student's eligibility for a grant or a loan. 1, what is your family size? And 2, what is your family income? So in January, a bipartisan group of 6 senators introduced legislation to simplify the student aid application and repayment process, including reducing the 108-question FAFSA form to just 2 questions. If our legislation becomes law, then families, guidance counselors, and admissions officers would save millions of hours. Most importantly, according to financial aid expert Mark Kantrowitz, the complicated 108-question form discourages up to 2 million Americans each year from applying for aid. Last fall, the president of Southwest Tennessee Community College in Memphis told me that the complex form turns away from his campus 1,500 students a semester. Tennessee's become the first state to make community college tuition free for qualifying students, but first each student must fill out the FAFSA. Now that tuition is free, the principal obstacle for a qualified Tennessee student to obtain 2 years of education after high school is not money, it's this unnecessarily complicated federal form. And finally, 10 years ago, the third example, then 3 years ago, surveys by the National Academy of Sciences found that principal investigators spend 42% of their time associated with federal research projects on administrative tasks instead of research. I then asked the head of the National Academies what a reasonable percent of time would be for a researcher to spend on administrative tasks. He replied, perhaps 10% or even less. Now, how many billions could we save if we reduced that administrative burden? Taxpayers spend more than $30 billion a year on research and development at colleges and universities. This year, the average annual cost of a National Institutes of Health research project is $480,000. If we reduce spending on unnecessary red tape by just $1 billion, the NIH could potentially fund more than 1,000 new multi-year grants. These examples should not be excused as normal run-of-the-mill problems of government. These examples and others like them represent sloppy, inefficient governing that wastes money, hurts students, discourages productivity, and impedes research. Such waste should be an embarrassment to all of us in the federal government, and let me make it clear, let's just not blame President Obama or Secretary Duncan. They have contributed to the problem, but so has every president and every education secretary, and that includes me, since 1965, when the first Higher Education Act was enacted. And the list of those embarrassed should also include the Congress of the United States for year after year, adding to and tolerating a pile of conflicting, confusing regulations. The Higher Education Act totals nearly 1,000 pages. There are over 1,000 pages in the official Code of Federal Regulations devoted to higher education. And on average, every workday, the Department of Education issues one new sub-regulatory guidance, directive, or clarification. No one has taken time to weed the garden. The result of this piling up of regulations is that one of the greatest obstacles to innovation and cost consciousness in higher education has become us, the federal government. So if all of us created the mess, then it's up to all of us to fix it. That's why more than a year ago, 4 members of this committee, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, asked a group of distinguished educators to examine the current state of federal rules and regulations for colleges and universities. We asked them not just to tell us the problem, but to give us specific solutions. They've done so in a remarkable document entitled Recalibrating Regulation of Colleges and Universities, in which they outline 59 specific regulations, requirements and areas for Congress and the Department of Education to consider, listing 10 especially problematical regulations. I thank Vanderbilt Chancellor Nick Zeppos and Maryland Chancellor Britt Kerwin for leading the effort. It's a remarkably good report. You did exactly what we asked. Instead of sermons, it was very specific. It's written in plain English. Perhaps we should get whoever wrote your report to write the regulations of the federal government. It reminds me of the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report of 10 years ago that gave us 10, really 20 things that we should do to increase American competitiveness, and because they were specific, and both Senator Mikulski and Senator Murray were involved in this, they eventually got adopted. This is a blueprint for the future. The report makes clear that colleges and taxpayers expect appropriate regulation, but neither taxpayers nor colleges are well served by the jungle that exists today. Consumer information that is too complicated to understand is worthless. Colleges must report, for example, the amount of foreign gifts they received, disclose the number of fire drills that occurred. Gainful employment disclosures require 30 different pieces of information for each academic program subject to the regulation. When a student withdraws from college before a certain time, a student's federal money must be returned by the government. That's a simple concept, yet the regulation governing this is 200 paragraphs of regulatory text accompanied by 200 pages in the Federal Student Aid Handbook. The University of Colorado reports they have 2 full-time staff devoted to this issue, one to do the calculation, the other to recheck the other one's work. Institutions offering distance education are subject to an additional set of bureaucracy that can result in additional costs of $500,000 to $1 million for compliance. All of these are examples of colleges and universities spending time and money on compliance with federal rules and not on students. Senator Murray and I will discuss how to develop a bipartisan process to take full advantage of the recommendations in this report and to include many of them in the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, which we plan to do this year. We'll schedule additional hearings to gather comment on the report from institutions who are not directly involved with the report, and we'll hear from consumers of higher education, including parents, students, and taxpayers. Some of the recommendations require change in the law. Many can be fixed by the department itself. I've talked with Secretary Duncan several times about this, most recently on Friday. He's eager to do his part. I look forward to working with him and President Obama on eliminating unnecessary red tape, saving students money, and removing unnecessary regulatory obstacles to innovation in the best system of higher education in the world. This is not a new subject for me. One of the first things I did as a United States Senator in 2003 was to try to simplify student aid. And I'm told the net result of my efforts was the reduction of approximately 7 questions on the federal student aid form. Those have been replaced by many more now. I authored a provision in the bill of the Higher Education Act of 2008 that required the Secretary of Education to publish a compliance calendar so schools could see all of their deadlines month by month, day by day. Unfortunately, 7 years later, the Department of Education has been unable to produce such a calendar. With bipartisan support and this groundbreaking report, the one we have today, I'm counting on this effort to get a lot farther than the one 10 years ago. Now we'll go to Senator Murray for her comments, and then to Senator Mikulski to introduce a witness and to make comments.